Still less must this complacency which abjures science claim that such rapturous haziness is superior to science. This prophetic talk supposes that it is staying right in the center and in the depths, looks disdainfully at determinateness, and deliberately holds aloof from notion and necessity as products of that reflection which is at home only in the finite. Just as there is an empty breadth, so too is there an empty depth. Just as there is an extension of substance that pours forth as an infinite multiplicity without the force to hold the multiplicity together, so there is an intensity without content, one that holds itself in as a sheer force without spread. And this is in no way distinguishable from superficiality. The power of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its exposition. Moreover, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have sunk the idiosyncrasy of the self in essential being and to philosophize in a true and holy manner, it hides the truth from itself. By spurning measure and definition, instead of being devoted to God, it merely gives free rein both to the contingency of the content within it and to its own caprice. Such minds, when they give themselves up to the uncontrolled ferment of the divine substance, imagine that by drawing a veil over self-consciousness and surrendering understanding, they become the beloved of God to whom he gives wisdom and sleep, and hence what they in fact receive and bring to birth in their sleep is nothing but dreams. In section 10, Hegel's criticism of the philosophy of intuition, which we've been following now for several of these paragraphs, is coming to a crux. He's going to make some of the most damning criticisms, and the ones that also reveal what he's moving towards in this section. So he's continuing this sort of line, laying out what the opposed position, the position that he wants to criticize, would be saying, and he calls it rapturous haziness. That's already a little pejorative. But where's he going with this? He says that people who are doing this, they feel that this rapturous haziness is actually superior to determinacy, to the notion, the begriff, to necessity, to science, to a system. And they're saying that actually they are the ones who are penetrating to the depth of things. They're the ones who have a grasp on what's most real. And by implication, what they're saying is that spirit belongs on their side. This stuff over here is not where the real show is, so to speak. That's not where real philosophy would go. That's where the philosophy of, say, Hume or Kant had gone, or sort of Kant, but not the really important stuff. So he says, this complacency which abjures science, it shouldn't claim that it's superior to science. It acts as if it's superior to science because science only deals with the empirical world. Now this is going a little bit further. Science deals with that which is determinate, that which has boundaries, that which has structure, those things that can be arranged in relation to each other. What we call discursive knowledge, discursive thinking. Oftentimes you'll see people, these days, they frame this in terms of right brain, left brain, and they'll say, yeah, I'm not so much a conceptual, discursive kind of thinker. I'm not a linear thinker, they like to say. I just sort of intuitively put things together. I'm holistic. So if Hegel were around today, this would be part of what he'd be criticizing. Oftentimes when you ask them, well, what do you actually mean by a whole? They can't tell you. They can't even give you a general idea. They can give you a word, and then after you say, well, what exactly does that word mean to you? Things start to fall apart. And the reason why this is the case is because they're actually not penetrating to depth. They're actually espousing a point of view which Hegel is going to say is the opposite of depth. It's actually superficiality. So how is he getting to that? He says, just as there is an empty breath, not breath as in breathing, but breadth as in, extension, so there's an empty depth. And just as there is an extension of substance that pours forth as an infinite multiplicity without the force to hold that multiplicity together. So let's stop and look at that passage a little bit. What is he talking about there? A extension of substance. So he's using this term extension, which was quite popular in modern philosophy. And, if you think about Descartes, for example, Descartes talks about two kinds of substance, really three, because there's God, but extended substance, so bodies, everything that we can measure, and then mind, whatever that happens to be. Extended substance would be the stuff that we're seeing here, things you can sense with the senses, sight, hearing. It's really interesting to think about this in terms of computer stuff, because I'm going to take this video and process it, and I can actually see the sound waves, at least a certain representation of them, and I can monkey around with them. I can do that because that is extension in a certain respect. Now, Hegel talks about the possibility of there being extension of substance that pours forth as a finite multiplicity. So multiplicity means there's a number of different things. Finite, of course, it's not infinite. There's a certain bound to it. A finite multiplicity without the force to hold the multiplicity together. No actual structure or force holding all this stuff together. It just falls apart. It becomes meaningless. It's what in Latin they would call, a heap, a molding of things. And so this is in no way different than an intensity without content. An intensity without content. So when these people over here are talking about depth, because they've had some sort of intuitive flash or experience, which isn't really an experience, because experience would be over here, right? It's something that you just have to feel, man. What they're really doing is they're talking about a kind of intensity that doesn't have any determinate content, that you can't actually put your finger on. That's why it's so nebulous. That's why it can mean anything that you want it to. And really, what is it ultimately based on? It's ultimately going to be based on feeling rather than thought. They think that they're having a higher thought than our ordinary, mundane, stick-in-the-mud scientific, systematic thoughts. But really what they're doing is they're just sort of having some hazy conceptions that are tied together with feelings, and there's no determinate content to actually anchor anything in, or hold anything together in, or dig in further to, or share with another person in intersubjective manners. So it's something that can feel good, or feel meaningful, or feel deep to one, but it doesn't actually have that. It's actually superficial. And Hegel says the power of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its exposition. So here's the really interesting thing. He's sort of saying, you guys have hijacked spirit over here. We're going to bring it over here, where it actually belongs. Unless you can actually articulate things in determinate ways, start arranging things. And it's not to say that you actually have to have a full-blown science or system worked out ahead of time, but unless you're being systematic in some sort of way that allows you to actually say that you're making some sort of progress and pose some definite problems for yourself and think of things in conceptual terms and try to figure out what the hell's going on in terms of something must be the case, you're not really doing anything, and you're not really engaging with spirit. Spirit's actually on this side, Hegel would say, at least for now, because that is what spirit requires in order to articulate itself. And over and over again in the phenomenology, we're going to see what we call shapes of spirit, Gestalten, shapes of consciousness, assuming some sort of determinacy that doesn't turn out to be the final story, that turns out to have some flaws in it, that turns out not to be the completed product, But spirit has to take on determinate form and shape, or else it becomes contentless, superficial. The dialectic stops, and all you're left with is kind of hazy feelings like you did something cool. So he says, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have sunk the idiosyncrasy of the self in essential being and to philosophize in a true and holy manner, it hides the truth from itself. Because what's going on over here has eschewed as beneath it what's going on over here. It's actually deprived itself of anything that would really give it depth. And it's actually not superior to what is going on over here. The requirement to articulate itself, the requirement to measure itself, the requirement to make itself substantial. So he says, it hides truth from itself, spurning measure and definition. Instead of being devoted to God, what is it doing? It's merely giving free rein to the contingency of the content within it and to its own caprice. So the people that think that they're in touch with God, in touch with the real, in touch with the holy, in touch with what is most valuable, what is absolute, by doing this sort of thing, are really manufacturing their own kinds of idols, which then they feel good about, because why not? It came from them ultimately, and it's suited to them, it's measured to them, and then they're surprised that other people don't get into it, and they can say, well, those other people, they're just, they're not in the know. This is where Gnosticism comes in, by the way. Total, side note. But they're not in the know. They're too stuck with, literal patterns and discursive knowledge, and they're too, I always get it mixed up whether it's left brain or right brain, but one of them is the one that's supposed to be linear and, good at figuring things out, but not very creative. We're the creative types over here. Hegel's saying, no, real creativity, real connection to what is divine, to what is most real uncovering of the potential of human being, it's not just going to take place over here, it's going to take place through this stuff. That's not to say that this is everything, but this is not going to be something that one can just put aside or denigrate or say doesn't matter. This is going to be the stuff that has to happen in order for spirit to actually understand itself, to articulate itself in time, to develop. And that's what the phenomenology is about. Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world that is hitherto imagined and inhabited, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past and in the labor of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long, quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born. So likewise, the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms. The frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, these are the heralds of approaching change, the gradual crumbling that, left unaltered, the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which, in one flash, illuminates the features of the new world. We come now to a turning point, a very dramatic turning point, where Hegel seemingly is changing the subject. He's finished with talking about the intuitive philosophy for a little while, at least. He'll come back to it later on. And now he's talking about the times again. He's approaching this in a different manner. He says that spirit is always moving on. Spirit is always progressing. So what does that mean? That means that in any given milieu, it may be, sort of stagnant spirit that has already reached the cusp of its development and isn't going to go any further, and is actually going to begin to decline and rigidify, ossify, or you adapt, you continue to change, you react to the new times, and you do so not only in a reactive way, but in a what we nowadays call proactive way, a thinking way, trying to make sense out of the new matters. He says, ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. A birth time. That's a really interesting way to think about this. Something new is coming on the scene. It's not just a period of transition. We're always engaged in transitions. It's a dividing point. Something new is happening. And he's not going to tell you exactly what that is in this passage. That's coming a little bit later. I want to use this schema right here to talk about the metaphor and the basic ideas between quantitative and qualitative that he's got going on, which he say ultimately culminate in a new world, bursting out like a sunburst. Think when he says a sunburst, imagine it's a cloudy day and you're going along outside doing something, and then suddenly the clouds open up and the sun just brilliantly beams down upon you. He's talking about that sort of dramatic change. Everything is illuminated. Everything looks different in a sunburst. It may dazzle you too. You may not be able to take it in. So he talks about this as being this birth time, and he says, spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. Spirit has broken with the world that it has hitherto inhabited and imagined. And that's a very important thing to say. Not only has spirit inhabited a world, the world that it has inhabited is partly the product of its own processes of thought, its own imagination. And its imagination is going to be liberated in this as well. Now, the metaphor that he's using is of quantitative growth of a child in the womb. You think about a baby and its development from, tiny little cells all the way to this incredibly complex thing, which is a tiny human being with a great big head. That's one of the things that differentiates us from the other animals. Its organs have become developed. It's almost ready to become, as you could look at it, as free or independent of the matrix in which it has grown, which include not only the mother who's been carrying it around, but also its, I don't want to say twin, but these organs that go along with it, like the placenta. These are almost sort of like crutches that can be dispensed with. Or use the Wittgensteinian phrase, a ladder that you throw away once you climb it, which I don't think Wittgenstein actually came up with. I think that's coming from mystical literature. But you have quantitative growth, and if you were only to look at the quantitative growth, you would not be able to predict that there would be a qualitative leap. But there is. And there's a qualitative leap in all sorts of processes where the quantitative can increase as much as it wants. But once it reaches a certain point, you've got something new happening, and you're in a new world. You're in a new condition. This would be birth for a child. Sooner or later, the point of the qualitative growth that it's undergoing is not to just keep on growing and growing and growing, but for something radically new, something higher, something with greater possibility to occur. Consciousness. Full consciousness. The consciousness of being an independent being outside of the womb. Now, of course, you can quibble and say, well, babies aren't completely independent. They have to be changed and fed and all that. You got to kind of go with this metaphor. It's a metaphor, right? You have to think what he's trying to get at. There's a fundamental difference between a baby before birth and a baby after birth. Part of that is in the nature of the world that it's experiencing. Part of that is in the liberation of its potentials, which are going to take a long time to develop, granted. Now, why is Hegel saying this about his own time? And can we say this about our own era more than 200 years after Hegel? Hegel is saying it in part because he's writing this at the same time that the Napoleonic Wars are taking place. And you got to remember, the Napoleonic Wars are not just a dynastic struggle between European monarchs. Napoleon is an emperor, but he's the emperor of the French, who have had a massive, decades-long revolution that has seen the beheading of royalty, the banishing of the church, the replacement of all of that by a regime that was dead set on making everything totally rational, even to the extent of imposing the decimal system on days and months, which didn't work, by the way, and which had developed not only a new way of doing things and articulating politics, and even down to, changing the order of military affairs, but had given people a different consciousness. The states in Europe could no longer feel as secure about the cultures they inhabited after the French Revolution. That's why it was such a traumatic event. Hegel is trying to make sense out of this. He's trying to say, what is the meaning of this new world that we've been thrown into? And he's going to see his own philosophy as being at sort of the center, the fulcrum of that. But this new world is no more a complete actuality than as a newborn child. It is essential to bear this in mind. It comes on the scene for the first time in its immediacy or its notion. Just as little as a building is finished when its foundation has been laid, so little is the achieved notion of the whole itself. When we wish to see an oak with its massive trunk and spreading branches and foliage, we're not content to be shown an acorn instead. So too science, the crown of a world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture, the prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path, and of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. It is the whole which, having traversed its content in time and space, has returned into itself, and is the resultant simple notion of the whole. But the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments, and which will now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element, in their newly acquired meaning. Continuing this metaphor of the new world, the new baby that has come on the scene, Hegel is going to draw out for us some conclusions from that, some cautions. And first and foremost among these is, when you have a new child, like I just pointed out in the previous section, that child is vulnerable. That child is not yet fully developed. We're different than other animals. For example, a little deer or horse foal can get up and start moving about an hour or so after it's been born and its mother has taken care of it. It's not entirely fully formed, but it's pretty much a little version of its mature parent. That's not the case for human beings. It takes us an awful lot of development, which can go off at different places and get drawn into cul-de-sacs where development just won't take place anymore. And as we all know, babies are incredibly vulnerable creatures. Left to their own devices, they will simply die. They won't feed themselves. They will cry, because they need to be changed, because they want comfort. And they are subject to what we might call all sorts of predation, either by other animals, by diseases, by the environment itself. So we can't expect that the new world is going to come on the scene as an entirely fully developed, all of its potential, completely worked out and explored sort of entity. Instead, what we're talking about is a new world in its immediacy. And I've got this arrow here, you'll see why in just a moment. Its immediacy or its notion. Hegel uses this term notion in several different ways. Sometimes he uses it for the beginning point of something. something that requires to yet be worked out further, to be developed, to take determinate shape. But that too is its notion. So there's the notion at the beginning, and then there's the notion as it develops. And he says that what we're talking about here is the notion of science. Now that's kind of a weird thing to say, right? Hasn't natural science been around for quite a while by the time that Hegel is writing? After all, the modern era is really the product of natural sciences and the great advances in it from the Renaissance, actually from some antiquity and also some of the Middle Ages. But we can quibble about that sort of thing. Let's just pretend the party line. From the Renaissance on, modern science has been showing us a new way to see the world, to see ourselves, to do philosophy. Who are you, Hegel, saying that science is still in its infancy? Well, science doesn't fully understand its own business, its own process and product. And actually, if you look at the history of science, you'll see that the scientists were not always on the same page about everything, and they could get into these tiffs where Newton and Leibniz are developing the integral calculus roughly about the same time, and they accuse each other of having stolen the idea, Newton more than Leibniz. And the British empiricists go with Newton's formulation and thereby set British mathematics behind for centuries compared to the Continentals. I mean, science is a messy business when you actually start exploring it and when you start looking at its history. So Hegel is saying science, the crown of a world of spirit. He doesn't just mean the natural sciences, and he doesn't just mean the technology that's going to be based on the natural sciences. He means the sciences across the board. So what we would also call the human or social sciences. Remember, we're talking about Wissenschaften here, not just the Anglo-American notion of sciences, the hard sciences. We're talking about the human sciences, which are always still in the process of developing and discovering and re-articulating themselves. Why? Because they're human sciences. Because they're a little bit more self-conscious about their own history and their own development. And he would also include things that we no longer call sciences, like the development of mathematics, like moral science, that is the science of ethics. He would say that is part of the process as well. So science is not really yet fully developed in his time. It's more like the new baby that's on the scene. So he says, science, the crown of a world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture, the prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path, and of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. Hegel's saying there's a lot of stuff going on in my own time that, people have been putting things to the experiment. Think again about the French Revolution and this notion that we're going to change society itself. That was not just about natural science. That was about what we call social science, about psychology, sociology. These things, even before they had names, people are working in them. And Hegel's saying, all of this stuff is going on, but it's going off this way, and this way, and this way, and this way, and this way. And not everybody's on the same page, and they're actually arguing with each other about quite a few of these things. Great example in his own time, theory of color. Goethe had one theory of color. Newton had another theory of color. They're both quite interesting. Ultimately, people went with Newton, but there's certain things about Goethe's theory of color that actually make quite a lot of sense. Hegel's saying, in order for it to really be science, in order for it to truly be knowledge, it has to be unified. It has to be a process by which rational beings are coming to know about this thing that they call knowledge and the objects of knowledge, which include themselves, which include the knowing subject, and include what connects the different realms of knowledge to each other. Now that is just in its infancy at his time. It's a good question about whether it remains in its infancy in our time as well. So he says, what's going to happen with this? And I put this question mark here. Hegel talks about this in terms of immediacy. And whenever you see that immediacy, don't just think about what is right on the scene, immediately on the spot. Think about a lack of mediation, a lack of something else which supplies context, which supplies explanation, which supplies our understanding of things. And there's going to be a lot of different things that are going to mediate. But what are we going to move to from the notion to mediation, or mediacy, we could call it. That means that when we are actually working in a truly philosophical and a scientific manner, things are always going to be mediated. There's going to be no sort of raw, we can start here and this is completely taken for granted starting points that we're going to be able to work with. This is sort of a side note, and this is something that will come up a little bit later on. There's something else that's going on in this passage that's very important that ties in with this whole notion of birth and development. He says that it's the whole, the totality, which has, having traversed its content in space and time, so it's got content, right? Determinate things. There we go. And these have been changing in space and time. Some of these didn't exist and then begin to exist. Some of these go off the scene. And the entirety, the whole, traverses itself through space and time, traverses all of these content. It returns into itself and becomes the resultant simple notion of the whole, of the totality, of the all, of the everything. You might say, what the hell is he talking about here? Well, where we're headed with this is bringing in the subject, bringing in the thinking subject as part of this process. We're the ones that are able to grasp the whole or the totality as such, and we are part of that very whole. And when we think about this, at first we form a simple notion of it, something which is not yet developed. And so we're usually going to do this by taking some particular kind of content and focusing in on that. But really, strictly speaking, we should be focusing on everything at the same time, which is very difficult to do, isn't it? So he says, the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments, and which will now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element, in their newly developed meaning. So what he's talking about there is saying that each one of these has undergone a process of some sort of development through human history, and that we're now at a point whereby grasping the whole and grasping the entire process of development, we can see what happened with each of these. We're in a position to see better than the people who were involved in the French Revolution just what was going on, what the real meaning of the revolution was, vis-a-vis the whole. They were not able to have a full perspective on it because it was still developing. Now we're at the point in time where we can at last have a truly scientific understanding of all of human development in politics, law, art, religion, philosophy, culture, all the technology, all these sorts of things. Now, you can debate whether Hegel is at such a point where he can make such a claim, but Hegel certainly thinks that he is there, and this is central to his project.